Hello, and welcome to the All Souls Housing Corps webinar, Displacement in DC, focused on Meridian Hill and Park Morton. For those who don't know, the All Souls Housing Corps is an affordable housing advocacy organization at All Souls Church Unitarian. We regularly put on educational events that are a chance for All Souls congregants and our community more broadly to learn about DC housing issues and engage with organizers who seek to build a beloved community that is affordable, healthy, and diverse. On today's webinar, we'll be learning about the historic development around Meridian Hill or Malcolm X Park. We'll hear from Mara Cherkasky, who's a historian, researcher, and co-founder of Prologue DC, followed by William Jordan, a local advocate and activist for Park Morton, which is an affordable housing community that is currently resisting displacement during the community's redevelopment. In addition, Ms. Hai, the leader of the Tenants Association at Park Morton, is on the call and will be speaking to us and answering questions from her perspective as the organizer and advocate for the tenants and a long-term resident at Park Morton herself. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and we thank you so much for your attendance. All right, Mara.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Mara Cherkasky, and I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. From beginning. Here we go, I think. You can all see that, right? Meridian Hill Park was built between 1912 and 1936 as a grand public garden, meant as a centerpiece for the gracious mansions and apartment buildings being built around it during the first decades of the 20th century. Since about 1970, it's also been known as Malcolm X Park. Either way, these 12 acres have witnessed countless concerts, festivals, and other events, including the Sunday afternoon drum circle, still going strong after 40-some years. With all the good associated with the park, it's easy to forget that it came at a human cost. I've documented that story for the Digital Public History Project, Mapping Segregation in Washington, DC. The story of the 40 mostly African-American families who lost their homes for the park. To back up a minute, in 1984, I was interviewing longtime residents of the DuPont Circle U Street area for another project. And one of the people told me how her family had lost their house on Meridian Hill. That story stayed with me all these years, and last fall I finally had a chance to explore it more fully. This map shows the little 1909, just before everything in square 2573, the outlined one, disappeared. 16th Street is on the left side of that block and 15th Street is on the right side. The yellow rectangles are wood structures and pink means brick. The settlement also included a few nearby blocks, and although those blocks weren't cleared for the park, most of them didn't survive very long. The public park that you can see marked below the red square was not actually there yet in 1909, even though it shows up on the map. This is 15th Street behind what is now the Mexican Cultural Institute, which you can see with all the chimneys before the houses were demolished in 1915. As you may know, the Mexican Cultural Institute is just next door to All Souls Church, which was built in the 1920s, early 1920s. Here's the map again. The wood frame houses were built in the mid-1880s, but the community dated to the Civil War, when there were Union Army camps and a military hospital on Meridian Hill, plus other encampments and hospitals nearby. These barracks stood where All Souls is today. All over the District of Columbia, Union facilities became havens for African-American refugees from enslavement who found shelter and jobs there. You can also see the white institution, Columbian College, on the map. And here it is at the bottom there on the 1909 map. Columbian College was founded here in 1821, but it moved to Foggy Bottom in 1912 and became George Washington University. The Baptist institution, Wayland Seminary, which trained African-American clergy and teachers, helped anchor the Meridian Hill community. Founded in 1865, its building here went up in the early 1870s, but it relocated to Richmond, Virginia in 1899. The community's elementary school was here, Wilson. The white school was nearby, H.D. Cook. DC had a dual school system until 1954. There was a colored division and a white division. That's what they were known as. Brick row houses and apartment buildings were being built all around Meridian Hill. Much of the area to the east of 15th Street was quite built up by 1909. You see all the pink structures. Building a park on Meridian Hill had been in the works for most of the first decade of the 20th century. In 1902, the US Senate Park Commission produced the so-called Macmillan Plan for beautifying the city and getting it back on track with the L'Enfant Plan, the original city plan. Among the numerous recommendations was a call to purchase certain parcels of privately owned land for future parks. The land included vacant lots owned by Mary Henderson along here between 15th and 16th Streets, and also across the street from her home, which was known as Henderson Castle. Here's a later photo of Henderson Castle. She owned a lot of land along 16th Street. She was buying it up for years, including the lot where the Mount Pleasant Library stands today, and I'm pretty sure also the All Souls lot. Henderson was trying hard to transform this area into the city's most elite, and she built a number of mansions that she sold to various foreign governments for embassies, which are still there, some of them still there today. She also pressed Congress to move forward in acquiring land for a park on Meridian Hill. But in the words of Gladys Scott Roberts, the woman I interviewed in 1984, by the time she got through dealing with the government, she not only took the land immediately for the park, she saw to it that the whole settlement moved, and it was quite tragic. In June 1910, Congress approved legislation providing for the Department of Interior to acquire all the land bounded by Florida Avenue on the south, 15th Street on the east, 16th on the west, and Euclid Street on the north to create Meridian Hill Park. Congress appropriated $490,000 to cover the cost. The bill also provided for the land to be condemned if it could not be acquired at a reasonable price, and for condemnation proceedings to be conducted by the US Attorney General in the District Supreme Court. The next January, Chief Justice Harry Claybaugh appointed 3 white real estate men to appraise the land. They published a list of dollar amounts for each parcel in July 1911. A few property owners, including 2 African-American owner-occupants, and the white landlords for 4 African-American households, accepted the amounts offered. Many of the other owners fought the condemnation, but in vain. By late June 1912, the residents were gone and development of the park could start. But buying up the land had been a lot more expensive than anticipated. In fact, it had used the entire appropriation. That meant park development could only start on a very small scale, and it took decades to complete. Now I'll tell you about just a few of the families who were evicted. This is a screenshot of the story map that you can access anytime you want at mappingsegregationdc.org. The tabs across the top correspond to the lot numbers on the map on the right side. When you click on a tab, in this case, lot 826, the lot is highlighted on the map and a photo plus the family history pops up on the left. The Scott family lived on this lot. Edmund W. Scott was only 19 when he paid $565 cash for 1508 Euclid Street on August 5th, 1884. The house was new then, and moved in with his mother, Lucy, 2 older brothers, and 11-year-old sister. Lucy Scott, his mother, had come to the district from King George, Virginia in the 1850s, and her 4 children were all born in the district. Edmund married in 1900, and his new wife, Imogene Magruder, who was from a prominent Georgetown family, moved in with him. Around the same time, Edmund's siblings moved to Reno City and Tenleytown. Here's a picture of Lucy Scott with her oldest son, Isaiah. That's Edmund's oldest brother, and Isaiah's wife and son. Lucy died in 1902, soon after this photo was taken. In 1910, the family on Euclid Street comprised Edmund, who was 45 and worked at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, Imogene, who was 32, and their 3 children, Edna, 9, Ralph, 8, and Gladys, 4. When the condemnation notices arrived, Edmund Scott and a couple of his neighbors hired a white attorney named Fulton Lewis and fought the eviction. In the end, Scott accepted the $3,673.33 the government offered for the 3,000 square foot property. In May 1912, he bought a brick row house at 1447 S Street Northwest, where the arrow points down in the lower right. That house is still in the family. Another family was this one, widower Cornelius A. Berkeley, a 54-year-old carpenter originally from Virginia, rented 2416 15th Street, it's the house on the left. And he lived there with his 23-year-old son, Harvey Berkeley, who was a baker, and 2 teenage nieces, Fanny and Susie Lee. Berkeley, and that might be him in the doorway, was a community leader, active in the 2nd District Republican Club, and at least 2 mutual associations. These groups were a form of insurance company in that they helped members with costs related to illness and death, and they also lent money for other. Census showed Berkeley working as a live-in servant in the household of the president of Columbian College, which we saw on the map, so right nearby. Berkeley was already dealing in real estate in the 1870s, and he bought property on this block in 1878. He owned and he built this house in 1881, and it was his house, and was the architect builder of some of the Euclid Street houses in the mid-1880s where the Scotts lived. For some reason, he no longer owned this house. In 1910, he was renting it. By 1915, he was living at 2221 15th Street, about where Columbian College had been, so it had moved 3 years earlier. And his son Harvey was at 1742 Seton Place. You see the arrow going toward the lower left. So one more family I'll talk about. George C.F. Rogers, a 64-year-old clerk with the Postal Service, owned 2402 15th Street, that's the center house, at least since 1900. He lived there with his wife, Mary, who was 41, and their 2 daughters. Grace was 18, and Eunice was 4. There's Eunice in the window. Both George and Mary Rogers had moved to the district from Maryland. Like Edmund Scott, Rogers fought hard to keep the government from taking his house. In 1912, the family was awarded $2,778.59 for the 2,500 square foot property. And that November, they bought a house at 1453 S Street Northwest, a few doors from the Scott family, their friends. This map shows where all the families ended up. Here are a few statistics for you. This story is about 40 families in 34 houses, 9 of them owner occupied. I was able to track at least one member of 37 of the families, of the 40 families. In 2 homeowner families, both spouses died during the condemnation proceedings. In 2 and maybe 3, probably 3 families, one spouse died during or soon after the evictions. You could speculate that stress played a role in those deaths. Most of the 37 families that I could track moved to African-American neighborhoods closer to downtown DC. A few stayed nearby, 2 on Mozart Place, a few near Howard University. 1 moved to Northeast near Union Station. 1 moved to Berry Farms, or Berry Farm across the Anacostia River. 1 went to near Southeast, 1 to Southwest, and 1 went to a farm in Beltsville, Maryland. That's not mapped. Here I've added a layer showing the 1930 census data, which is the first year that the census provided statistics for smaller areas. The people who did not move to African-American areas were a maid in a white household in Georgetown, that's the one farthest to the left, and a janitor in a white apartment building in Columbia Heights, that's the farthest one north. Also, 1 moved to a small African-American section of Eckington that would soon be taken to build McKinley High School. That's Henry Parker, one of the ones on the to the east, the top one to the east. In the 1930s and 40s, white residents in row houses on many of the blocks east of 15th Street signed covenants preventing sales and rentals to African Americans. The red and blue areas show covenants. The Mount Pleasant Citizens Association were able to get covenants on almost the entire neighborhood in the late 1920s, and that's at the neighborhood at the upper left. The park is outlined in red. You can see that at the bottom. So you can find all the family stories at this URL, mappingsegregationdc.org, and you can email me with questions later on if you'd like. Thanks very much. And now it's William's turn to speak. William Jordan is a local activist, and I got to know him when we both worked on the Columbia Heights Heritage Trail 11 or 12 years ago. There's a trail sign, a Columbia Heights trail sign in front of All Souls Church, or just down from All Souls. Or there was until a truck knocked it down a few years ago, and I'm hoping it'll be back soon. William?
Good afternoon. My name is William Jordan. I'm a resident of Columbia Heights, and I've been in the neighborhood probably since coming here to go to Howard in the 80s. I'm here sort of a substitute guest to speak on behalf of the residents of Park Morton to kind of share their experience and the current dynamics at play that have similar throwbacks to what Mara just shared with us. Also on the line is Shante High, who's the president of Park Morton Resident Council, and hopefully we'll bring her up after I do a few introductory remarks. For those who don't know, Park Morton is a public housing property right off of Georgia Avenue and Morton Street in Northwest in Ward 1. It was opened in 1960. And ironically, it was built to capture people who were displaced from Southwest urban renewal, or as we know it as Negro removal, the decade prior. So it's interesting that you'll see the same pattern, is that it was created because Southwest had to be saved and redeveloped. And now Park Morton is going through the same thing when it was designed to be the answer back in the 60s. The property has 174 units. Each unit is 2 bedrooms. about 160 something units were actually used. The other units were for offices and community room and other factors. So back in 2007, Park Morton was included in the city's New Communities project. And I don't know if you're familiar with New Communities, but New Communities was a spinoff of the federal Hope 6 program that was occurring in the city with the redevelopment of public housing properties. So Hope 6, which promised that public housing units would be replaced one for one, and that the residents who were currently living in those properties would be moved off and they would be brought back, and they would be able to get new units, and they would become a part of mixed income communities, and we would all walk happy hand in hand into the sunset. And as we know, Hope 6 really didn't do that. Many projects around the country only saw 11% come back after development. In DC, in many cases, the housing authority who's in charge of that process brags when 30% make it. So typically at least 70% of the people who were promised to return never made it back. So after a murder in Sursum Quarter in about 2000, I think it was 5 or 6, the city decided it would do a similar project and call it the New Communities Project. And it had the same goals, but it built in safety valves to make up for the losses of residents who would be displaced and never really make it back. Because in many cases, you know, they would tear down the units immediately, and then 10, 15 years later, they would look to bring the residents back. So in New Communities, they came up with a concept called Build First. And the goal of Build First is that you would build on the property first and then kind of shuffle residents around so no one would have to leave their community unless they wanted to. And then that would allow them or increase the odds that people will have the ability to return to the community and reap the promises. As well, learning from Hope 6, they created a human capital program that was designed to work with residents on their credit, on employment, on all the things they would need, because once that new community was built, they would no longer be living under the housing authority, but would be living basically independent, work under the management of whoever managed the properties. And the district would put out an RFP and select a developer, and the process would move forward. In 2007, Park Morton became a part of that process, and the city began to hire 2 developers, Landex and the Warrington Group, to make that happen. And of course, it got stuck, because we're still here today and not a single unit has been built. In 2014, after the first group failed to move the project forward, the city brought in a new development team. And the expectation was construction and development would begin in around 2016, maybe into 17, and we would move forward. But we're in 2020 and not a single new unit has been built out of that process. However, in the meantime, over, I would say at least half, if not 2/3 of the residents since 2007 have been moved off the property, and in many cases replaced by a new set of residents. And so now when they restarted the process, you had displacement, and then the housing authority replaced those units. And that's been the process that we're, here today. I wanted to highlight a few points. My involvement with Park Morton really began in 2009 when I was elected an ANC commissioner in that area. I didn't represent the Park Morton area, but I did have a relationship with the resident council president at the time, Marie Whitfield. who was well known in the area, and she herself had served as an ANC commissioner. During that time, Ms. Whitfield called us together and explained that the city had, or the federal government had set aside rehab money for Park Morton. So as you could guess, by 1960 to 2007 or so, the property needed repairs, and it was much neglect. And so she had organized people to get the money from the federal government in order to redevelop the property so they could live in a quality standard. The city working with the housing authority, pulled that money because Park Morton was in the New Communities program, and it was pressure within the community to get rid of that public housing property. Later on, Ms. Tamika White became the resident council president at the time of the 2014 development. And at that point, the city had torn down a nearby school, the Bruce Monroe School, which was going to be the Bill First site, and Park Morton process would begin again. That school got tied up in a lawsuit, and so it hasn't gone anywhere to this date. So because the process and the way it's working and the length of time that it's going on, people are being displaced from the property. People are being moved out of the area, out of the city. Many people are being located to across the river, other wards, despite the promise that no one would be displaced until there was a Bill First site for them that they could move to and would not leave the property. Couple more things. So before I think Ms. High is available, but before I move on, because I think she can really talk about the vision, the efforts that the residents have had to fight to maintain their position on the property, because as we know, once you go, you lose your leverage over your life. And so she's been fighting with her residents to make that happen. But in that process, when the city's programs failed again and again and again, the resident council came up with their own plan, working with a committee that they had put together. They wrote to HUD and asked HUD to sell the property to the residents at the same price that they're going to sell it to the developer, which is either a 99-year lease for not $1 a year or $10 fee simple for the entire property. So the residents decided, since the city couldn't get it done, that they needed to organize, find their own developer and try to get the land for the same price. And of course, the city has ignored them, the housing authority has ignored them, HUD has ignored them, even though the law gives them the right to do so. So what I want to do is briefly share my screen and walk through their equity plan, because the important thing we really want to get across is those residents haven't just been fighting and complaining and sitting back, but they've taken an effort to move forward with their own plan, their own strategy to take control of their own destiny. And I think, you know, as we move forward, that's the kind of support that we desire. So I'm going to share my screen. And so hopefully you see the slide, but we call the Park Morton Equity Plan. The desire, and on the left here, you will see this is what a typical Park Morton housing complex looks like. And here is one of the new developments that the city has sponsored in the area down at 965 Florida Avenue. You may be familiar, this is where the new Whole Foods is coming in. But because it's part of the city's project, it requires 130 affordable units to come to this project. So the Park Morton Equity Plan, the residents proposed that since you don't have a Bill First site, that we would like to utilize those affordable units that the city already sponsors so people aren't dislocated from this community, which was a promise of the New Communities program. And then I wanted to briefly touch on, this is the promises of the New Communities program, which is to preserve the affordable housing in stock, to ensure the economic integration of residents into the new community is going to be built, and enhance the residents' employment and job placement opportunities. Because if you're going to be in a new community, you need to be prepared. And then the principles are one-for-one replacement, build first, and human capital. That's the program that's designed to work with the residents to ensure that they are better prepared to be a part of the new community. This is some of the information that I just spoken about. This is 965 Florida. Down here is where the city-sponsored project is with 130 units. Up here is where Park Morton is. And the goal in order to move forward with development is to move between 30 and 40 residents. That would free up current buildings on the property, and those buildings would be demolished, rebuilt, residents could return there, and then residents in the other sections of the property could remove in those units, and then those properties could be torn down and rebuilt until that community was redeveloped. And again, the goal of that is to minimize the disruption to the residents, because as we know, moving is a stressful process. Moving when you're forced to move is even a more stressful process. And this is an area view of the Park Morton footprint you see in this slide. These are some of this is a typical floor plan of the REN, and that's where the 965 Florida, and these blue units are the affordable set-aside units. So it's just to kind of show that the units are available if the city and the housing authority would work together to make that happen. And to make that point, New Communities is a partnership between the city, DMPED, the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, and the Housing Authority. And they're supposed to work together to make this happen without displacement of residents, or without, this is kind of a view of what the new development is going to look like. And the last thing I wanted to do is this is the contact information for Ms. High, who's the resident council president of Park Morton. Should you want any additional information and to learn more about the New Communities project, Park Morton, their struggle, their efforts to move the city to move forward and to partner with them. So that's basically all I wanted to share at this point. I don't know if you're able to connect them, Ms. High.
Ms. High is on the call. If you're all right with it, Ms. High, I'll unmute you now. Great. Chris having a little bit of trouble. Could you, there we are.
Hello, can y'all hear me? Okay, thank you for having me. I appreciate this. First of all, William did touch on a lot of points with the Park Morton redevelopment. And we have been going through this redevelopment for this year makes 13 years. The Park Morton, Bruce Monroe part of Park Morton's redevelopment, the land went back to court last February, Valentine's Day, February 14, 2019, was the last time the land went into to be heard, and we're still waiting on a decision. So the reason why the Park Morton Equity Plan came up was because we do have a lot of residents that are very flustered with this process. They want to remain in their neighborhood, but they're tired of the runaround and they want to get something done. So with that being said, I put together a team. My team and I saw an opportunity to be able to, since 630 and 640 buildings have been boarded up now 12 years, 13 years this year, why not just, if you're going to voucher people out, empty out the last 2 buildings, start with the multifamily building. Those people that are on the property now who would like to move to the multifamily building that qualify will be allowed to move into that building. I personally am upset about all of the qualifications that have been put into place because they literally are exiling our residents who have been long-standing citizens in this community. You know, a lot of people ask why things are generational here. One of them was policy that has now been taken away, so you won't have generational living here anymore because the grandfather program has been removed. And this is why I am pushing for equity in my community, because now that the grandfather program has been removed and the head of household, if anything happens to the head of household, the children will not be allowed to inherit the apartment they were once residing in. They will be removed from the apartment. And this has happened on our property. Lord help me that I was hit by a car last year and I survived. If I didn't, my children would not be here right now. So this is why I'm pushing for equity. We need to own, we need a permanent place for our children to reside. They're Washingtonians, they deserve to stay in their communities. This equity plan is being pushed because there are so many pieces of it that will help families break this generational curse of being oppressed. We are trying to build a future for ourselves and our children. We want equity to build our wealth as well. There are steps that we're taking to do that, and we would like it if we would get more support behind us on that, because DC Housing Authority has not been holding themselves accountable for the lies that they tell. And there are a few people that are riding with those lies. It's a shame, the tricks that are being pulled. I can't even get into grave detail about everything, but I can tell y'all in 3 years, a lot of things that could have been done have not been done. And a lot of the things that could have been done to uplift our residents and put them in a better standing right now has not been done. And a lot of my Park Morton equity plan has been dissected and is being implemented, and it's not right the way that they're doing it. They're literally just tearing the neighborhood apart, and they're throwing people Ward 7, Ward 8, Ward 5, Ward 2, and we were told we can stay right here in Ward 1, and this is why we chose the rent, because we don't know what's gonna happen with Bruce Monroe. You know, there were other parcels like Arcade Sunshine over here on Lamont Street. I didn't put it in a presentation, but I mentioned it to the DC Housing Authority that it's right across the street. We could house some of our families there with a voucher. There's one other place I can't think of right offhand. Mr. Jordan, please help me think of the other place. Type it in the chat, please. But I can't think of it right offhand, but there was 3 different places that we actually had in mind that we could house people right here in our community. So with that being said, I really, really appreciate Mr. Jordan stepping up, taking time to, you know, fill you all in on the equity plan and our redevelopment. I don't know if you all have seen these, but this is what Bruce Monroe is supposed to look like. I don't know if you've seen any of this, but that's what it's supposed to look like. And also, this is what Park Morton is supposed to look like. So this is what you saw in the Park Morton Equity Plan. As you can see, we were told now that we would get 1-for-1 replacement, which is replacing all of our 2-bedroom units, because every 174 units on this property, and each of them were 2-bedroom units. But as you can see, I don't know if this is really clear or not, but most of these are 1-bedrooms and studios. There are not very many 2-bedrooms at this Park Morton family building site that's supposed to come up, and that's supposed to go in this building, okay? The majority of the 2- and 3-bedrooms for the families will be going inside of the townhomes that are supposed to come up on the property. Oh, sorry. These are the townhomes and the stack flats that are supposed to come up at Park Morton. In the past, and I'm gonna wrap it up after this, I just want to show y'all something really quickly, because Landex and Warrington Group actually engaged the residents in our redevelopment process, and we got a chance to do our own rendering of what we wanted in our community. This is what the residents of Park Morton actually wanted when Landex and Warrington Group were our development team. We actually made this. We created this as residents. Now, we're actually putting more housing down here with this plan than with the plan that Dante's partners, TCB, NCI, are currently putting down here. So I just wanted to share that all with you. And I want to thank you all for having me and allowing me to take a moment to speak on our situation. And if you would like to talk more, because this is an extensive conversation, you may call me. I'm not in the office as much, except on Saturdays. Today I'm geared up to distribute food to my community, which I've been doing for the last 4 months during this COVID pandemic. Through my business, I own a business which I developed as part of the Park Morton Equity Plan to help move myself towards self-sufficiency, high alert emergency preparedness, and I help prepare families for exactly what we're going through. Pandemics, endemics, man-made disasters, all types of natural disasters, CBRNs, and EMPs. So whenever you all are ready, I am available for your services. But thank you so much for having me, and give me a call. Mr. Jordan shared my contact information. You may email me, call me, text me, whatever is convenient for you. So thank you so much.
Would you mind putting your contact information in the chat if you have a moment to?
I sure will.
And I've noticed we've had some questions. Mara and Mr. Jordan, I know you were both available to stay on. Ms. High, would you be, if you're willing to as well, we'll move to Q&A. Chris?
Great. Well, one of the questions that came up in the chat was regarding the build first process and displacement. And maybe Ms. High or Ms. Jordan can answer this. Did this happen because of a lack of an oversight mechanism that failed, or because of the lack of any mechanism to ensure the building of new housing before the communities were displaced?
Hit your space bar. Chris, can you unmute her, please?
It's unmuted.
Oh,
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
yes.
Okay, so there were 4 residents that reside down by the Bruce Monroe Park that sued the city for the redevelopment that has been tying up the parcel of land for this redevelopment. And like I said before, we don't know what the judges will do with that. We don't know the decision, but it wasn't a faulty mechanism. It was 4 residents that live around the park that band together to decide to sue the city, to sue the city and NCI for the redevelopment. They were complaining, saying the building was too large, you needed to scale it back. They didn't like other things. It was just a bunch of hoopla. So it is what it is. It's tied up in court.
Yeah, I think the part I would follow up on as well is that, you know, given that it was tied up in court, the city and the developers and everyone took the position that the project could not move forward because the project was tied up in court. And of course, the development of the equity plan is to look for an alternative way to do it. Because time ticking works against the residents. So, you know, 2 years ago, really a year and a half ago, the Housing Authority found lead on site, and they had to go remediate all of the buildings because of the lead. They didn't remove, really they didn't remediate, they have another word for it, they covered it up. So they went in and covered it so it wasn't exposed, but the buildings were deteriorating condition. And so the kind of, you know, when your first plan fails and there are alternatives to move forward, I think that is what the equity plan, and that is where I think the city has dropped the ball. You know, the residents don't have to wait. They shouldn't be hung out to dry. Again, this started 2014. This is 2020. And if all goes perfectly to plan, in 2021, they will start construction of the new building, which will then take an additional 18 months to 2 years to complete. So we're maybe talking 2023 before moving forward. And so, you know, this is where the oversight and this is where the problem was. They had one plan. When that plan didn't work, they put the burden on the residents to carry the load. And that was what's unfair and what's problematic.
Another question from the chat is the proposition to turn Park Morton into a co-op whereby the residents would then own the buildings? If so, is the issue getting the funding to buy the properties, or is it not having an opportunity to bid on the property in the first place?
It was not, the residents have not been given an opportunity to bid on the property. The equity plan calls for looking at all of those options. So we actually proposed through the equity plan to take the 2 buildings that Ms. Hyde had referred to that have been boarded up for 12 years and tear those 2 down and build a co-op that the residents would be owners in. And then the other push that Ms. Hyde and some of her residents have really pushed for is individual family ownership in some of the units, because they're building townhouses that are for that purpose and to put residents on the path for individual home ownership. And the Housing Authority and city have programs that can make this happen. And they're finally looking at that as an option after Ms. Hyde has pushed, since I've known her, to make that happen.
How many residents currently live at Park Morton, and how many live there at its peak?
If you could repeat that.
How many residents currently live at Park Morton, and LaShanta answered 147 residents at its peak. How many are living there right now?
Ms. High?
She had answered in the chat that she's uncertain because DCHA is lying about how many families have moved off the property. So, you know, in terms of immediate action steps, are there organizations that are helping to support the residents of Park Morton? And is there anything, we've had as many as 51 people on this Zoom call today. Is there any concrete action steps people could take in the short term to support the residents of Park Morton?
Well, I would hopefully, if Ms. Hyde can't unmute, she would be best to answer that. But I think the first thing is that the residents want the equity plan put on the table and given serious thought to, and those rights dealt with. And if they can't do it, then don't do it, but to give the residents an opportunity. So any support to push the housing authority and DNPED, the mayor, to do that, I think is immediate action. The other is more practical. Residents are being moved even now during the COVID pandemic. And many residents have made the choice to do that because of desperation. Or are being moved with promises that are, we don't know that we believe that those are going to come through. And I'll let her speak since she's unmuted. Ms. High.
You should be unmuted.
Okay, so yes, Mr. Jordan is right. DC Housing, I've spoken to several residents who've been relocated, and DC Housing Authority has made them promises to be able to come back, just like they've made promises that when people move, they'll be able to come back. When they said that when Bruce Monroe was done, when this whole thing first started, this is why I keep asking them to put things in writing, and they refuse to put it in writing because they keep coming back changing things. So when this first came up, they said, if Bruce Monroe gets built up, residents can move to Bruce Monroe, wait out the redevelopment, or they could take a voucher and move off site and wait, wait out the redevelopment and then come back. They would have first rights to return to Park Morton's footprint. But then a few months later, they came back and said, no. If you move to Bruce Monroe, that's your one-time move. You have to stay there. You cannot come back to Park Morton. And I immediately got to fighting with them about that. That's not what you said. That's not what you promised. I need this in writing. They keep saying one thing and doing another. And we in our community have a saying that they're talking out the side of their neck because they're looking at us and saying one thing, but telling somebody else something different over here. And they're treating us exactly opposite of what, now, like I said, I just had a steering committee meeting on Thursday, this past Thursday, and I was not happy with how things were handled. Not happy at all. Because DCHA has now put their key players into place, and I'm calling Kent Bass out on this. He's in this chat, and I'm gonna let him know I'm not happy about how y'all did this. I'm not happy about it. And I got some moves I'm gonna make to counteract that, so get ready, Mr. Bass.
I have another question, which might be a little bit more general and might bring Mara into the conversation as well. We've heard some history from the early part of last century. We've heard a lot of history from Mr. Jordan and Ms. High about the history of Park Morton over the past decade or two. I'm curious what people think about what's the importance of sharing the history of these neighborhoods in helping the current fights of today. I mean, we've seen history repeating itself to some extent, which was kind of the premise of this whole webinar today. I'd be curious to hear some reflections about, you know, the big picture and how telling these the stories of this neighborhood might help with today's fights.
Displacement and homelessness is a big issue in DC, and the Park Morton Equity Plan helps to resolve some of that. We don't have a bunch of people just being lazy in this community. We have working families here, and we want to honor those working families by allowing them to have a chance to build a future. DC Housing Authority is not allowing that. And what was the second part of your question?
Just how does understanding history help in today's fights?
Having been trained by the late great Miss Marie Whitfield, my former resident council president, and knowing what I didn't know back then when she said to me, Miss High, we're sitting on prime land. I didn't know what she was meaning when she said that. But as the fight continued and more developers sought their sites on our property, I began to understand the history of why Howard University wanted this area, why different developers wanted this area, why people of our community want to remain in this area. So the history that I knew of Park Morton was not the history completely that I learned today. Okay, when I came in here in 2001, the history that I learned was very different. It was very violent. You know, I have helped cure some of that. Not all of it, but the majority of it. I have helped cure that. And I'm calling my ANC commissioner out, the ANC chair out again, Mr. Bass, did not help with curing this. He has the power to get people and entities and policies in place to help cure these problems, but he did not. But now that the problem is being rectified, now he wants to fight to get what he wants in this area. But I'm gonna tell you right now, you're gonna have a fight on your hands, baby. Because Miss Hyde wants what she wants, and the residents want what they want. And I'm looking dead in this camera because I want you to understand what I'm saying, okay? Ms. Hyde's not going down without a fight. And everybody on this call, I want you all to know I have fought very hard for this property. DC Housing Authority has pulled all kinds of tricks and dirty little come-uppances and all kinds of stuff to get me to fold, to get me to founder, and to put my fire out. But let me tell you, the fire has grown in intensity. And it's not going out. I'm gonna fight even more with what I got. And I call upon my ancestors to do it. So this neighborhood does not belong to just the hood guys. It belongs to us, the people that work, the people that reside here, the people that have put up with so much in order to just have a peace of mind, to have a roof over our head. And to be honest with you, housing is not keeping these roofs over our heads because we're spending money out of our own pockets to maintain these places. They do the major stuff, but not the little stuff that leads to the major stuff. So hear me out when I tell you that we deserve to have our equity. We deserve to remain in our neighborhoods. We work hard, just as hard as anybody else. We may not make as much money as everybody else, but we deserve to have the same freedoms and luxuries and American liberties as everybody else. Stop oppressing us, please. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. High. We are right up against 5 o'clock, but I want to give Mara the chance to have the last word, both on this question of the impact of history and telling the stories, and also a very specific question in the chat for Mara, which is beyond the efforts of the actual families who were displaced in the creation of Meridian Hill, were there other allies who resisted the development? Was this seen as a fight among private property owners, or was there a recognition of any sort of larger struggle?
Okay, well, good. Unfortunately, the history is pretty sad, and that is that African-American communities all over the outside of downtown DC, so outside the original city limits of Meridian Hill, Tanleytown, there was a large community from post-Civil War on, well, post-Civil War into the 20th century, and elsewhere up in Fort Stevens and elsewhere in Ward 4. Those were, even though people owned their land, they were removed from Meridian Hill by eminent domain. They were removed from the Reno area by eminent domain. Also, that started in the 20s and was completed in the 40s. And actually, Edmund Scott's 3 siblings all moved to Reno City. They bought land when they moved from the home they shared on Meridian Hill, and they or their families, because some of them didn't survive, died before the 1940s, but they or their children all lost their homes. So that family, and coincidentally, Gladys, Edmund Scott's daughter Gladys Roberts, lost a house too in Brookland. So that family lost 5 houses that I know of. There may have been more. And I mean, now Brookland was sort of a different story, but anyway, there was a concerted effort to remove African-American communities because they were seen as light. And that happened all over. So they either taken by eminent domain, or maybe they got offers too good to refuse by developers, or they didn't own the land. That happened a lot in some of the small communities in Ward 4. There was one around the Soldiers' Home and up by in Lamond, around Lamond Riggs area and elsewhere. If they didn't own their land, then of course the owner could decide to develop it and just kick them off. So the history is there, and and then there was the large-scale urban renewal of Southwest that removed 23,000 people, black and white, mostly black, but mostly poor, mostly black, and a lot of them were pushed into far southeast, and without the services to help care of them. And so the history is there. It's kind of precedent was set a long time ago that those communities could be pushed off land if somebody wanted it. And we've seen that more recently, not necessarily large scale, but always large scale and small scale. But you see nobody wanted to live in DC. I mean, there was white flight starting after World War II. Well, then when people did want to live in DC, all of a sudden people who had been here a long time, a lot of them lost their homes because somebody who could pay more suddenly saw it as desirable. So the history is there. So then this question about so people, I don't know that they had a lot of allies. I don't think they had any allies helping them. Meridian Hill, I don't think, I mean, they organized as well as they could, but I don't know of any organizations that were fighting for them. Reno City, they also organized, but it took decades, but I don't know of large organizations stepping in to help them keep their land.
I wanted to make a couple quick points even on the Park Morton. Even the current plan, if there was no lawsuit and everything, still has a $90 million budget gap, right? So the government, so part of the history is you see government action with promises, but the funding to really take it through to the end is often not there. So again, you know, if there was no lawsuit and everything was going perfectly, there's still $90 million that the city would have to find to invest in this project to make it happen. And, you know, and I think that's, you know, that's the pattern when people don't have their destiny in you know, in their hands. So it's not, a lot of times it is people up against government forces. Even with Meridian Hill project, she was not talking to the wind, she was talking to government forces that could displace and remove people. Southwest, new communities, Hope 6, you name it. And what needs to happen as we move forward is the voices of community, of people who are part of the political system, the voters, have to speak up and hold their government accountable for the promises that are made. And people's silence is what the problem is. People are willing to be silent. But when you know the history and the story of people, families, individuals, people who can relate to, people who are like you, people who look for a future, don't just want a piece of housing, but they're thinking about their families and generations to come, then I think, you know, we work together to make these projects better. No one wants to stop development. They want to be a part of it. They want their families to prosper, and we want a process that makes that happen. And that's why we need people's voices. Even if they don't all agree, we need people's voices to hold the government accountable.
Thanks, Mr. Jordan. That was a great note to end on. Thank you so much for everyone who attended. This was a great and informative webinar. I'm glad it went by. Thank you to Chris, who made sure that it went by without a hitch technically as well. And we'll follow up. We can share information, contact information. And if you have further questions, feel free to reach out. Happy Saturday, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.